If you have a choice between a place that values you as a human and takes measures to make sure that your experiences of belonging are real, or a place that feels like you're treated like a robot and your value is based on what you produce, I mean, what would you choose, really?
Welcome to the Belonging Chronicles. This is a production of Revolve Consulting, a business dedicated to helping organizations and the people within them build and sustain a culture of belonging for all. In this episode, we'll start off by spending some time talking about why addressing bias and stereotypes are so important to the practice of building a culture of belonging. After that, we'll review a 2023 report from Indeed.com and Oxford University that discusses the importance of well-being in the workplace. And finally, we'll engage in our how-to discussion by spending some time thinking about how we get people who are regularly disrupting or threatening belonging to pay attention to our collective efforts to create it. Let's get started. I'm Jeff Bucholtz, and I use any and all pronouns.
And I'm Janelle Melendrez, and I use she, her pronouns.
So to begin today, we thought it would be useful to start off by bridging together what are sometimes understood as separate conversations. We've found that belonging, which we define as the feeling that we're part of a larger group that values, humanizes, and respects us, can often be interpreted as something that comes out of people simply being nice to one another. Now, while kindness can and does play a large role in belonging, it is not the only or even primary component of building belonging, especially in a work environment. This is why we talk about VHR, how we value, humanize, and respect one another. So let's break this down just a little bit more for our collective understanding. Valued. We define this as when we experience being recognized and acknowledged for the ways we contribute to the environment or the people around us. Humanized. This means we are acknowledging the wholeness of a person. We're putting their overall well-being and humanity at the forefront of our interactions with them. Respected. This means we treat one another in ways that support our self-determined identities, honor our boundaries, exhibit trust, and are affirming of who we are and what we do. And what we know from our experiences and a solid body of social psychology research is that when those characteristics are threatened, belonging disappears quickly. This is why we want to start today's conversation with a discussion about how bias and stereotypes facilitate a major threat to belonging. For our purposes, we'll define bias as a particular inclination, feeling, or opinion about someone or something that can be conscious or unconscious, and we'll define stereotypes as an overgeneralization about an entire group of people applied to both groups and individuals from within that group. So why do we need to address these as part of building a culture of belonging? Janelle, you want to start us off?
Sure. I think it's a wonderful thing for us to think about, and I think it's sort of a basic understanding here. I think we're talking about two things that are just polar opposites of one another, right? We can't operate in that place of actively promoting bias and stereotypes and create belonging at the same time. They're actually working against each other. So when other people, right, we do things like stereotypes and bias and things like that, we make them feel like they're not a part of the group. It works against their ability to trust us, for them to feel safe, for them to want to stay in an environment where this is happening to them, to feel encouraged to be there, and on and on and on. It communicates that we are not a part of the group, right? The bias and stereotypes, which works against the idea of saying we are a part of the group. It's sort of like when people do the come close and stay back thing. It's a mixed message, right?
Right.
So that's sort of what comes to mind for me. How about you?
Yeah. No, that makes sense. One of the things I found when I was thinking about this earlier was social psychology research from the early 2000s that I stumbled across by Walton, Cohen, and Garcia that noted how for members of socially stigmatized groups, the question, do I belong, appears to really go hand in hand with the question, does my group belong?
Yes.
Right? So I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense, right? So people's feeling of belonging gets tied in closely with how the groups they are part of or groups that others assign them to are perceived and treated. And for me, like this was huge because like if I'm aware that a group I'm part of is devalued, then I'm immediately going to be concerned about whether I'll be able to belong or not. Right. Like that's right away. I'm gonna be like, ooh, before I even go in there, I'm gonna be like, oh, this is not gonna be good. And if I'm part of a group where I know, like straight up know that there's a stereotype or a bias against me, I'm likely to feel like I don't belong because I'm anticipating experiencing that particular threat, that particular stereotype or bias. Like I know it's coming. It's going to be there. And so I'm amped and ready for it because it's hurt me before. It's been wielded at me in a way that doesn't help me and causes pain or harm to me. And so like I'm prepared for it. So for me, I was thinking like this is a big part of why we want to remove these negative stereotypes and biases because they're almost certainly going to lead to people feeling like they don't belong, like let alone the other types of cumulative harm that it subjects them to.
Oh, that makes so much sense. The thing that came to mind for me right away is like one of my superpowers as a woman of color is I can walk in, and particularly as a Black woman, I can go into a space and immediately know within seconds, how many people like me are in that space. Are there other Black women in that space within seconds? It's a superpower,
Oh,
right?
oh yeah, I've seen you do it. We went to
There's like
we
three.
went to we went to the yeah we went to the theater and I mean like within seconds you had like clocked who was in the space.
Right? And so there's representation. So there's that one that kind of visual representation of belonging that may or may not be true, but it's sort of a hint on whether or not that's there. So when you are one of few or one and only inside of an experience, so you come in and you're like, oh, there's only two other folks, right? This is just an added layer. So if on top of that experience now, there's bias against me and stereotypes that I'm experiencing on top of the being one of few and one and only, right? That only is going to reinforce the idea that I don't belong here. And so I love this quote around it's not just about do I belong, but does my group belong? And sometimes when I go into a space, there's a clear indication for me on whether or not my group belongs. Because if I'm the first one, what's going on here, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm curious because like when we had talked about this in the past, you had told me you're like, I just saw how many people are in this space when we went to that theater, and I think it was
Mhm.
four, if I
Oh,
remember correctly, out of like hundreds of people. And when I asked you like, what is that practice about for you? I remember one of the things you said, well, like at a base level, it's like a safety thing, right? It's like a am I safe in this space? But what I
100.
hear you saying is that there's this whole other layer, right? I mean, safety is like a base level, Maslow's hierarchy, right? Like that's further down. But that it sounds like that's a piece of this for belonging for you too. It's like you walk in the space and when you're one of the only people in that space, like there's a sense immediately that I might not belong here or I might not be
Yeah,
welcome
there's
here.
an inkling, right? Where like I need to find out more of what's happening here, that this is what is occurring. Is this out of intention? Is this out of lack of intention? Is this just an odd day? I need to find out more because then I'm going automatically to systems, and how are the systems and structures set up that this is the reality that I'm experiencing.
So I'm curious about why is it so important for us to be actively removing bias and stereotypes? What does that do for people in stigmatized groups? What does it offer for them? And then on the flip side, what does it offer everyone when we're removing it from the
Right. And
space?
and I think when we're talking about workspaces, and I think we'll get into this a little later, we all do better when we thrive. We all do better when we can thrive. And if I'm having stereotypes kind of hurled at me, there's something called stereotype threat, right? So I'm already aware of the stereotypes that the world has about Black women. I'm already aware of the stereotypes that people have about me and different social identities that I have. And so the idea of stereotype threat is that I have to make sure that I don't do the things that cause you to think those things about me. So I'm already
Mhm.
navigating all of these things already. And the idea of being able to come into a space and go, oh, okay, that's not the reality here. It allows me to be in that space as me. We talked about being valued, humanized, and respected. It's very difficult for me to feel valued if I'm feeling folks are stereotyping me. It's very difficult for me to feel like I'm being humanized if I am being clumped together with a larger um, assumption about an entire group of people where that group of people had no say on whether or not that was true, right? So, as the person who is concerned about a stereotype, if they're not there, it gives me the freedom to bring all of who I am into the space from a professional standpoint when we're talking about work. But outside of that, the real person that I am and what it gives for everyone else is their ability to get to interact with that person.
That's so important too, right? Because sometimes we forget that like I might miss out on that piece of you, right? This really interesting characteristic of Janelle or my coworker who is entering into a space where they don't have, I think you said, the freedom to bring themselves into that space in an authentic way, to bring all of who they are into that space. I'm now losing.
Mhm. Absolutely.
So I'm losing the laughter that might come out of that. I'm losing the friendship that might come out of that. I'm losing
Mhm.
potentially here, right? I'm losing the creativity that might come out of that, the help when I'm stuck on an assignment that might come out of that. Like all of these things I'm losing, even though I'm not the one who's necessarily directly being affected by the bias or the stereotype being present in our work environment. It's not at me, but it's taking something away from me
Absolutely.
because I'm losing something that you can't bring, that you're not able to bring in, that you don't feel comfortable or safe to bring
Which
in.
will impact, right? When we're talking about teams of people or groups of people, which impacts their outcomes, how creative they are, what they're able to produce, like all of those things. Um, Joy that is experienced as a group, right? Our ability to connect and thrive together, like all of those things are impacted by the individuals coming into that space.
Yeah. Yeah. So it goes without saying here, our position is, generally speaking, bias and stereotypes are harmful and things that we don't want people to experience, right? But what we're saying is that it is critical that we focus our efforts inside our organizations to prepare ourselves to question our own biases, to help our colleagues when those biases and those stereotypes are coming out, because it's damaging belonging for the entire organization, which is to say it's damaging our productivity, our creativity, our connection, our happiness, which is what we're going to talk about in a moment.
And if I could just add, just to be clear, um, bias happens, right? There's no one who can say, I'm just going to choose not to be biased anymore. I'm going to turn that button off. It's not going to happen anymore. You know,
Yeah.
Bias happens, and that's okay because we're human and that's why it's happening. But it's bias that's acted upon that we're talking about here that's harmful in an environment, because you're going to have those things that happen. It's what you do with that when it happens that impacts the space. Is there a face that you're making? Are there words that you're saying? Are there actions that you're taking that are impacting individuals based on those biases you have?
Why are we bringing this up? Well, because we are often asked this question or have faced the question, why should we talk about bias and stereotypes inside of our workspaces? Like, why should we carve out time to do that? So when I hear this question, my first thought is like, well, because they're hidden. Like the whole thing about biases is that they often operate without our being aware of them. Not always, but often. And stereotypes, well, like so many of them have been hidden in the culture, like a parasite or something that is just like feeding off our souls without us realizing it. So then what we need to do is like to be aware of them. We need to bring that into the light. Like the conversation is the disinfectant, or in my metaphor, the antiparasitic medication as such. Which I'm sorry, I know is totally gross, but that's like it's the antiparasitic medication. So if we don't talk about these things, then those biases, those stereotypes coming out of us and entering into the work environment, they're going to subject people we work with to harm. And that is going to damage their well-being. And as we will discuss later, that's going to damage work relationships, productivity, and more. So, yeah, it's uncomfortable potentially to talk about these things, but we should talk about them because then we can help one another monitor and disrupt them, kind of like removing the toxin, removing the parasitic infection as such from our work environment. We want to remove that. We want to get rid of it. And to do that, we have to like face it and know it's there.
I'm thinking about how not talking about it, right? Let's go with that, right? Not talking about it really limits us, limits the environment, limits the organization because by having the conversation, the training, the deep dive into these topics, it really gives us an opportunity to learn from and about one another. As I learn about others, their culture, their perspective, their ways of being, my perspective is broadened, right? I have access to new ideas. I can expand my creativity. The thoughts that I have sort of have a new light to them because I have this perspective I hadn't thought about before.
Yeah.
It just seems like that part is so, so important.
Yeah. Do we don't want to lose that? Think about all that richness you just described that you're about to lose. And if you lose
Right.
that, how do you even build relationships at that point? Like, I mean, like you'd be limited, like deeply limited in your capacity to build relationships, build connections, collaborate, work on projects. But if you get rid of these things, if you get rid of, I'm going back to my parasites, if you get rid of the parasites, if you get rid of them, and you said this, like you can't get rid of bias. We're not going to eliminate all stereotypes on planet Earth. But if we can treat them, maybe I'll say it that way. If we can treat them, then all of a sudden we do get to benefit from that richness.
The other thing that comes up for me is, I like me, right?
I like you too.
I
I
think
like
I'm
you
an
too. You're
interesting
cool.
person,
You
right?
are.
But if I was my only source of information, if I only understood and I got stuck in my perspectives and my belief system and my experiences and the things that hurt me and the things that damage an environment for me, then I don't grow from that, right? Like I can't have all of the experiences. I am one person. But if
Yeah.
I'm able to understand not only what impacts me, but what impacts other people, then it allows me to be able to work with and serve people who are not me, right? It allows me to have that ability, that wisdom, that skill to be able to interact in ways that are helpful and supportive and affirming to other people, not just me. And
Yeah.
I think that is where the value of having these conversations and trainings and things like that in the workplaces because we have a job to do there, and that means that we have to work collaboratively with others. We have to serve customers in many cases, and I'm not poised to be able to work and serve others excellently if I don't understand what their experiences are. I don't understand what biases I have that may come into play and impact those relationships, and I don't understand the things that cause harm. And so I think just from a personal perspective, I want to grow inside of an organization. I want to do the best I can at whatever position I'm doing. And I'm not going to be able to do that if my limited resource of understanding how I relate, harm, avoid harm, build belonging with others is just me.
Yeah. Well, and if you are harming others, you are going to have very limited resources because they aren't going to want to help you or connect with you anyway.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's, yeah, well said. Well said. So, in this section, we will spend some time discussing findings from an Oxford study that was conducted with data from 1 million. Yeah, you heard that correctly. 1 million individual well-being surveys filled out through the recruiting company, the hiring company Indeed. This is a massive sample of actual workers from the years 2019 to 2023 who are employed or were employed at companies listed on the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. So, like, needless to say, the report is based on some massive, incredible data sets that reflect mainstream corporate culture inside of the United States. So, Janelle, I'm curious, as we both looked at this, what stood out most to you in this report?
There were so many things. I love the idea that these were employees. It wasn't the leaders who were saying this is how people feel. These were a million people who were doing the work from day to day. So, one of the parts that stood out to me was a quote in the article that said, "In the C-suite, they have a difficult time dealing with the fluffiness. They don't like softness." So the author was saying that they only want to look at KPIs, those key performance indicators, that they consider their objective. But the only way to measure how people feel at work is to ultimately ask them. Such self-reports are necessarily subjective, but our research shows that they relate to highly objective outcomes. So the idea that the C-suite, right, the organizational leaders inside of all of the organizations that these 1 million people responded to, see this idea of belonging as fluff. It's fluffy. We don't really need to do
Mhm.
that, right? And I get it because it's about the bottom line. There's key performance indicators. What are our objectives? How are we going to get those things done? And I think it's so important because, think about it. If you have a choice between a place that values you as a human and takes measures to make sure that your experiences of belonging are real, or a place that feels like you're treated like a robot and your value is based on what you produce, I mean, what would you choose, really? Right? For me, I understand that a significant portion of my life is spent working, like many, many people. A significant portion of our life is spent at a job. And so I would rather choose to be humanized in that significant portion of my life, right? So the
You want to be seen as like a unique individual with like history and needs and
Absolutely.
things that make you happy and sad?
Absolutely.
That
And
is,
I think the
my
pandemic
goodness.
really highlighted this idea for us in that people were feeling like, wait a minute, I'm not a robot here. I can't do all this stuff and, eat, So, I
That is
mean,
y that's so funny, but it's also so sad because I can't count how many people I know who don't
yeah,
eat
yeah.
while they're because like, "I didn't have time to eat today," and it's like,
Mhm.
"Damn." Right? Like, that's not right.
Absolutely. So it's the idea that we have been for many, many decades really trying to fit our humanity to support our work. And I think this kind of research really highlights the point that our work needs to be shifted to fit our humanity, right? Because we have these places that if they want to be in the S&P 500, if they want to be in the New York Stock Exchange, they have to be able to have creativity. They need to be able to have all different perspectives. They need to be able to thrive. And yet, if my humanity isn't recognized, if that place of belonging is only seen as fluffiness that we cannot invest in, then that becomes a detriment to all of those things that that company wants to produce. So that was one of the things that really just kind of was highlighted for me.
Yeah. Uh, that's so valuable. What you're saying is so important and is a hard thing for us to navigate as a culture because we really have the way you said that we've been trying to squeeze our humanity into a structure that's about getting as much productivity out of us as, and this is the weird phrase, humanly possible, except the human part is not really what's being prioritized here at all. And so my first reaction to what you're saying and what this report does is say, nah, y'all, the fluff is connected to the same kind of like metrics. And not kind of, it's connected to the same metrics that you're using and that we have been using for so long. So in a sense, what it's doing is bridging this gap where the data is now telling us, look, the fluff isn't fluff. It's the same stuff you've been taught to look at, that the frameworks of business, KPIs, productivity, money, bottom lines, that is now no longer something that is disconnected from fluff. It is intimately connected to fluff, and we know it. And so now this is something you need to pay attention to. This is something you need to integrate into your work. So I think that that's really fascinating.
Just the term like fluff sounds like it's extra, right? And so
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
the terminology around how they're describing, rather than vital to the work that we're doing, we need to make sure we're taking care of the employees who work here, right? It's, oh, that's fluff, that's
Yeah.
extra, we don't really need that because we got to
Yeah.
produce.
And no, exactly. But I also have to say, like, I got to defend the fluff here, because like fluff is like, that's like a puppy, like a poopy
Yes,
puppy. You know what I
yes.
mean? Like puppy fluff. Like, why is that a bad thing? That's a good thing.
Gosh, so
Okay. Sorry. I digress there. But yeah, I think what you're saying is really important. And that's something that we need to work on as a culture, and in businesses in particular. And one of the most fascinating things I found is directly connected to this, because in the report, they did a comparison of how major companies in the S&P 500 and NASDAQ would compare in profits to what they called a well-being, like a well-being 100. So if there was like another index, right, of companies that had high levels of well-being, i.e. the well-being 100, how would they compare to NASDAQ and S&P 500 companies? And the report says, taking the period as a whole, using our main aggregated measures of subjective workplace well-being, which combines happiness, stress, satisfaction, and purpose, we find that investing $1,000 using this strategy in January 2021 would leave an investor with around $1,533 by the start of July 2024, compared with roughly $1,479 or $1,408 and $1,401 had they been invested instead in the S&P 500, NASDAQ Composite, or Russell 3000, respectively. So, like, yeah, you heard that correctly. Companies with higher employee well-being provided better returns on investment than all those other companies. And when we're talking about companies in NASDAQ and the S&P 500, we are talking about companies where their shareholders, right, are what they seem, at least from my perspective, to be deeply and understandably motivated by, right? The shareholders want returns. And what this is saying is you'll get better returns if you are focused on well-being. You will out-compete and outperform companies that do not. It's like a mic drop kind of finding for me.
That's gold fluff.
It says like it's gold. It's gold fluff. It is gold fluff. It's extra fluffy gold fluff. I love it. So, in another major study that was cited in this one that leveraged the Indeed platform, it was found that companies that treat their workers well attract more job candidates and hold on to their workers longer. And this can carry significant implications for company performance, given the expense of hiring a new employee. And here's a quote from the authors of the report: knowing your company cares about you, having friends at work, feeling a sense of belonging, it all matters. The pandemic gave us the space to think about the ways we work and focus on what really matters to us. Companies need to get more creative when it comes to figuring out what employees want. They can't just write a paycheck anymore.
That's that, right? It's not about the money.
That.
It's, I mean, I think about it, how often do we talk about what happens at work with our friends and family, right? We're mobile advertisements,
It's like
right? For what it is like to work at the places we work
How are
in.
the kids? Yeah. How are the kids? How's your family? How's work?
One and
Like
the same,
that's
right there.
Those are the questions.
Right
Yeah.
there. So it's like good, bad, and different. We're sharing this with the people that we love, that we spend our time with. So, I mean, imagine having a friend who consistently talking about their job as being horrible, right? And they're never promoted there, or they can't stand the people they work with. Are you going to go, yeah, let me know when you have an open position because I'm going to try apply,
Sounds like a lovely place to hang
I'd love
out.
to join you in that place, right? No, they're moving the other direction, like hard pass, So I mean, this quote makes a lot of sense to me. How about you? What was your thought?
I find myself thinking specifically about how difficult it is for us culturally to imagine a workplace where companies have to think about doing more than just writing a paycheck. Like what are the frameworks? And this is what you were talking about before. Like, what frameworks must we be operating from that would lead us to think about people as resources rather than sentient creatures who benefit from feeling cared for? Like, what are we operating from? And honestly, this is one of the reasons I'm a big fan of companies who ditch the term human resources and use something like Office of People and Culture instead. Like, it just makes so much more sense to me, and it frames things in a way that's more beneficial for what we actually want to accomplish and for what we need to accomplish to improve our bottom line, which is what the motivator is for so many companies. But the idea it's about more than a paycheck? I mean, come on, like this should be running a company 101. I mean, it should be running a company 101. And I want to acknowledge that we work with lots of companies that do this, right? It's not like no one does it. Like, we work with lots of companies that do this or are working towards
Yeah.
doing this. And I think what's particularly valuable about this report and the data sets attached to it is that it gives proof. It's proof for those of us who already believe this to be important. It's an opportunity to explain this in terms that some people are going to be more comfortable with, right? To explain it in terms of the bottom line. What's the ROI? What's the return on investment, on investing in employee well-being? And the answer is more money. It's more money, let alone everyone being in the place and enjoying their work environment.
It's sort of one of
Yeah.
those, and I think at every
Yeah.
company across everywhere, if you gave people a choice, I want to work in a company where I have well-being, where my well-being is important versus a company that doesn't. I think everyone would say, I'm going to choose the one that
For sure.
values me as a human. My well-being is important. Yeah.
For our listeners, Janelle's talking about an activity we would do where we would literally say, what do you get when we prioritize a world of respect, or a world where we prioritize belonging, or an organization where we prioritize belonging? What do you get? What are tangible outcomes? And people say all kinds of things, right? We're more productive, we're happier, we get along better, there's less
People
conflict,
stay
right? We want to
longer.
come to
Yeah.
work, we stay longer in the job. Like it, and it's not, it takes no time for people to fill in this
Seconds.
list. It's like, boom, it just happens, seconds. And then you go to, okay, what about a world where that doesn't happen? And it's like, right? No one wants to be.
Discrimination,
It's like,
people leaving, right? Like, yeah.
yeah, we're arguing all the time. It's conflict ridden. It's a place where we're drained. We feel exhausted. People aren't communicating effectively. And it is, as you said, it has never failed to both shock me at how easy it was for people to fill this out and do it that quickly, but it's also never ceased to amaze me how obvious it is, and yet how we're not and haven't been culturally investing in it because people had the disconnect. And the disconnect, I think, was around that is fluff,
Yeah.
not gold fluff that creates that creates more money and more of what we're after as a company, which is of course a motivator for companies. So
And I have to admit, there's a little part of me that feels, maybe a bigger than a little part of me, that feels a little bit sad that when we're talking about taking care of one another and taking care of our well-being, where the reason behind it is because you'll make more money. There's something a little bit
I
about
know
that
it's
feels a
kind of
little
dirty.
icky.
Yeah.
Like I want to shower a
Yeah,
little
like you wanna
bit.
take a
Yeah.
shower afterwards. Yeah.
Because I wish we
Yeah.
were in a space,
Yeah.
and we're not, but I wish we were in a space where people would go, oh, well-being? Yeah, we should do that because we should.
For
Yeah.
each other, for ourselves, yeah.
And we're just
Yeah.
not in that space. And so that's what I really appreciate about this study is, while there are some, name some of our client partners, right, that are doing this and working really diligently to make sure that they're moving to center humanity in their workspaces, it will take some folks to be able to understand the bottom line and what the connection is with my KPI in order to motivate them to do it. But I just had to name it. It
Yeah.
does make me a little bit
Yeah, no, I'm glad you did because we've talked about that many times, and it is,
Um,
yeah, it is a little sad. It is a little sad, but now there's no reason to be sad because there's no excuse to not do it now because
You got all
it's
the
both
reasons.
things, right?
You
Like
got
you
all the reasons.
ain't got a reason anymore to not do it. Now, what was interesting too is that when we were looking at this article, we stumbled across a podcast called Offline, where happiness researcher and Professor Laurie Santos was talking about her observations about this report. And so I thought it might be fun for us to listen and react to her observations. So we're going to go ahead and do that.
So what makes a happy company and a happy workforce? Like, what are some common traits of companies where the workforce is happy and they're doing really well?
Yeah, well, the Indeed study pointed to, again, something that like folks just didn't expect. They actually did this clever thing. This is a work of Jan Emanuel Deneve and his colleagues. He first surveys economists, say, hey, I have this data set where we really have these factors that predict happiness. What do you think are going to come out at the top of the factors that predict happiness at work? And the economists say salary, like how much money people are earning, things like, how good your manager is, work-life balance, that kind of stuff. Those things are predictive, but they're kind of middle of the pack predictive. The thing that predicts the best, whether or not you're happy at work, is a measure of your belonging at work, which in the Indeed hands is made of a couple different constructs. One is I feel that I matter at work. Like people care about the work that I do. It like matters to the company. But also I have a best friend at work. That single item measure, do you have a best friend at work, yes or no, predicts a lot of the variance in people's happiness at work.
Do I have a best friend at work? Yeah. Do I have someone I'm connected to at work? Oh man. Isn't that such an interesting clip?
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, right? We know that there's been tons of research around why people leave and why they stay. And so much of that has been tied to the people, the money, but the people that they work with.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the people you work with the people are what build a sense of belonging. We kind of talk about like organizations building a culture of belonging, but cultures are made up of people. And I think what's striking from the report, again, is the way this belonging and happiness leads to tangible outcomes. Like, for example, in the report, they cite that happier employees have been shown to A, develop more supportive relationships with colleagues and supervisors, B, demonstrate higher capacities for cooperation and collaboration, C, have more satisfied and loyal customers, and D, even prove to be better negotiators. Like, what else do you need to hear to start prioritizing belonging now?
Wow. Just with that clip, jobs can be stressful, right? They can be stressful. Sometimes you have to make really difficult decisions. Sometimes things get a little heated. Sometimes there are tight deadlines you have to manage, all kinds of things, right? And to have a best friend at work that you could talk to and work through that stress means that stress can dissipate a little bit, and then I don't add that into my work. We know that when we're stressed, we don't make the best decisions. When our stress is high, we revert back to times when we had less skills than we currently do, right? Like there's all these things that happen. So I'm just trying to think about work stress, right?
Yeah. When we're more stressed, we're more likely to rely on bias
right.
or fall back on biases and stereotypes.
Absolutely.
I mean, so yeah, that's such a great point. It's a stress reducer to have a person, or at least like, hopefully more than one person, but at least one person at work that you enjoy. Like that's something that reduces your stress.
Absolutely.
So why? And it's not like we're saying like all companies have to do things and give everyone assign everyone a best friend.
Make sure you have a best friend buddy before.
Make sure you have a bestie.
Week 3.
But there are things that you can do in a company that facilitate that, right? I mean, like even just in your onboarding practices, there's things you can do to help build relationships and create spaces where people get to hang out and spend time where they're not super stressed out as well.
Oh, so good.
All right. In this last segment, we wanted to answer a common question we get in our work. how do we get people who are regularly disrupting or threatening to pay attention to our collective efforts to create belonging? Now, this question usually comes with a bit of frustration, as it seems that those who most need to understand the importance of belonging and how to create it for others are often those who are most disinterested or resistant to discussion about it in the first place. So this is our how-to segment. Janelle, you got any thoughts on this one?
I would say first we work with the willing. And I know that seems sort of against what the question is asking, but I think it's so important. We talk about,
Agreed.
we're preaching to the choir is what some people say, but that choir needs the support. And the reason why is because we all have different spheres of influence. So there's different people that we impact, that we are close to, who trust us, who we influence, right? And so sometimes those are the choir. So when we're working with the willing, it's inevitable that we're going to tap into some of those unwilling folks, those resistors, if you will. So I think that there's just really not enough to be said about supporting the willing or the choir, the people who are working to create belonging. Maybe they are an early adopter and they really believe in this culture of belonging. And we want to make sure that we are giving them the tools that they need, because likely they're going to be the ones who are the influencers of the people who are disinterested or resist building belonging. They're going to be the ones to do it. So it's absolutely invaluable to make sure that we are working with the willing. The other folks who are resistors, we'll get to them, but we have to be able to provide the tools and the support for the people who are all in or just got in, right? Like we want to make sure, because they're going to be the ones who impact those other folks. At the same time, by providing them the tools, they can then hold accountable to the culture of belonging the folks who are resistors. If we're giving them the tools of how do you call folks in, how do you understand what it is that needs to be done here and remind people of that? How do you, like we give those tools to them, then they're going to be doing that with the other folks. So that, I think, it doesn't sound like that's the question, but I think it's so vital to the question that we work with the willing. And then aside from that, I would say that organizations really have to be clear on what I call their in this place rule. So that means that they have to be clear on what their values are and uphold them. So what are the behaviors that are and aren't okay inside of the organizations? What is and isn't okay to say inside of the organization? What are those values? And do the permissible ways of being uphold those values? So am I saying we really value X, but this behavior over here is okay, but that behavior is against X, then our in this place rule is not in place. So in this place is really about what are the things that are okay inside of here? What are the things that we value? What are we geared toward? What are we going to allow here? Outside of here, as long as you're not impacting this place, you do you. But inside of here, we're upholding the values of in this place. And so it comes down to that accountability from an organizational standpoint, inside of policies, procedures, structures, making sure that we are clear that this is what we value here. If we value belonging, okay, show me the policy. If we value belonging, show me what's okay here. And making sure that we are really clear. And then again, supporting those folks who are going to help us on the day-to-day call people into that space, because they now have some structure to say, well, in this place, remember, in this place, this is what we do. And that is outside of it. So those are my thoughts. What about you?
Okay, so for me, there were a couple things that came to mind immediately when I thought about this question. And first, I think the key element here for me, or at least one of them, is to not be totally discouraged by it. When this question is asked, I feel like there's a lot of there's a lot of frustration and people get discouraged, and that makes sense. But like, we aren't all the same, right? I mean, that's the beauty of diversity in groups, and that means that some folks are going to have very different and conflicting views about how a workplace should function. And to be honest, if we're using our culture as the backdrop, like our broader culture, I mean, as like the backdrop for that attitude, the framework for that attitude, going back to what we said earlier, it kind of makes sense that there are people like this. Because we've said forever, that this type of work wasn't valuable. It was fluff. Like, I've heard belonging work or things like it called, and you can put, by the way, the words BS behind any of these, right? Touchy-feely, hippie, new age, worthless, politically correct, waste of time, foo-foo, fluffy. Like, it's just like this litany of criticism, and that you were highlighting earlier, this framework that really makes this work seem unhelpful, meaningless, not valuable. It's pretty toxic. So I think we have to keep in mind that for these resistors, we got to approach them not like they're completely out of their minds. Like, they didn't imagine that this stuff isn't valuable. They've been told that this stuff isn't valuable. So I think that feeling of being discouraged, we got to go, like, don't be discouraged, because like it makes sense in the context of our culture and these frameworks that there are going to be people that struggle with this. And our job is to help them struggle less, right? Because they're going to benefit from this as well. Okay, so it's the first thing. Second, there's a difference between engaging in conversation with someone and getting them to stop harmful behavior. Like, those can go together, but they don't always. Like, for example, I don't think that if someone is regularly disrupting belonging in a work environment by, consistently disrespecting and devaluing other people, like, I do think that if someone is doing that in an environment, that needs to be brought to not just their attention, but the attention of their supervisors, potentially to the attention of human resources. Like, that's something that is a violation of how we live those values together in this workspace, like in this place operating principles. But there's this other piece, because conversing with them has a different objective, right? Conversing is not always about accountability. Conversing is about connection and understanding, I feel like, a little bit more. And so when I think about conversing, it's like, if it's about connection, we're going to have to give real room to find out how they connect to the core principles of belonging and how they can make sense of them. Like, what do they get out of it? Or how can they understand what others are getting out of it? Like, this person may say, I feel valued and respected. And it's like, yeah, that's great. But what we're finding is not everyone does. Now, this is helped sometimes by collecting data and finding out how people experience well-being inside of an organization. Now, the hard part of this is when you ask people questions about how they feel in an organization, they're going to tell you. And when they tell you, you then have to like do something with that information. And that's hard. But we're going to have to ask and find out why and how these folks connect to or don't connect to belonging if we're trying to converse with them. So I think there's just a little distinction there. And third, I'm going to go back to where you were, Janelle. I want to kind of question the question a bit, because I feel like it's often stated or implied that this is the person we most need to speak with. You were clearly talking about this before. And I'm honestly not always convinced, much like you are, that this is the person we most need to speak with. I mean, we need to speak with them, but I firmly believe that those folks are not who we're really seeking to engage initially. It's those people, I think, the people we're trying to get to are the ones you're talking about. It's not the people that are resisting actively. It's the folks who don't actively promote belonging, even though we know they believe in it, even though we know they're benefiting from it, even though they're not opposed to it. And I honestly think that that those folks should be our primary focus, because as they begin to engage more and more, we develop that majority and that momentum to establish new norms. And like you said, those are the folks who are more likely to be able to influence those resistors anyway. They're the ones that we really need to influence those resistors. So it's not just establishing a new norm. They're the ones who can engage and connect with those folks.
As you were talking, I was just thinking about being careful not to apply those practices that threat belonging in our approach or narrative designing of the resistor as well, right? Wanting to make sure that we continue to engage in a culture of belonging, even in how we are recognizing the person or persons who are resistant. Because sometimes it's easy to get caught up in that othering practice because they're not like us sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
I think
So those who threaten belonging, is that how you
that's
said
right.
it? Like those who threaten belonging, we don't want to then threaten belonging to stop them from threatening
right?
belonging.
Like we're working against ourselves. Remember, there's a whole
Yeah.
system
Yeah.
here in operation. And so we don't
Yeah.
want to help the system by trying to stop the system. All right.
Yeah.
You know, it's like
Yeah.
those two things. Again, we're doing that thing I was talking about earlier where you're saying, come closer, stay back, right? There's the mixed messages. So making sure that we continue to be in our practice of building a culture of belonging, even when it comes to people who are resistant. That does not mean that we don't hold them to account. That does not mean that we let things that are threats to belonging slide. That does not mean that at all. It just means that as we're working with folks from a generative lens, from a lens that doesn't just automatically assume that people are bad people because they think something different than we do. And I think associated with that is the idea of being real mindful of what's happening with ourselves, because we also have to leave room for the idea that we may not fully understand where they're coming from. We may have biases that are sort of coloring this picture for us, if you will, but we have to understand that there may be points that are activating us as we're understanding and engaging with this person. And so being mindful, I think, of that as well, so that we can make sure that we're being centered in belonging rather than our reaction to whatever's coming up for us. And again, that does not mean that we don't hold them accountable, that we don't call them in, we don't report when it's something that's egregious. You know, we not saying any of that, but we want to, isn't this interesting, recognize our own humanity and recognize their humanity, coming full circle in this conversation, and taking care of ourselves from a well-being perspective so that we can continue to uplift belonging.
Yeah, that's a beautiful. That's beautiful. I think that's a good way to wrap this up. The master's tools will never dismantle the
That's
master's
right.
house, right?
Audre Lorde.
Audre Lorde. All right, so I think that is probably enough for this pod. So want to thank everybody for tuning in and listening. This concludes this episode of the Belonging Chronicles. Please do subscribe and like, and if you enjoyed this at all, please share it with a friend or 50 friends. We're trying to help get word out about the podcast. We'd really appreciate that. And of course, if you'd like to reach out to us, you can find us at revolveconsulting.com. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye.